Okay, hi Ed. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing fine, thanks. Thanks for coming on. I think we just mentioned this before, but we looked it up. You've been on the show 3 times and consistently yearly and almost to the month. You were
That's
on
funny.
November 20, November 21, September 22, and now September 23. But this is the first time that you're on the video show for some
Oh, well.
strange reason.
Yeah, I don't know why that is, although considering maybe the video just wasn't working for us.
Well, maybe. I don't know. I was wondering if we had tech issues before or whatever, but you're here, so we're glad to have you here. Without being repetitive, since this is a different show, uh, just give us a little bit of your backstory and then we'll talk about your book. I know your book is, this is a reprint or a reboot, or what do you want to call it?
Yeah, the current one is it's a new edition of my very first published novel from 25 years ago. So my background is in journalism, actually. I started as a newspaper reporter, photographer in my hometown of Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and then I moved to Regina just over 30 years ago now, 35 years ago now, which is the capital of the province, and I've been here ever since. And 30 years ago, next month, I became a full-time freelance writer. So for the last 30 years, I've been writing, publishing, editing. I've written more than 60 books of science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction for readers of all ages, won multiple awards. I've been a writer in residence, so I've done a lot of teaching writing. And then 5 years ago, I started a publishing company called Shadow Paw Press, named after our cat. And I've got a lot of books out through there now, and I'm publishing a lot of other authors. I published a few of mine, including Soulworm, the new one, which is a reprint. And mostly what I published on my own is stuff that came back to me from other publishers. The rights reverted to me, and I wanted to bring them out in new editions. But I've published a ton of other authors, and I have many more coming up. I've got a very busy publishing schedule lined up. So that's what I do. I work with words, and I work with books, and I get them out into the marketplace.
How many authors do you have on your publishing company?
Oh, I haven't counted recently, but it must be at least a dozen. Some of those are reprints, some are original work. I've got a bunch more lined up. So, yeah, there's probably at least a dozen other authors that I'm publishing or will be publishing soon.
Let me just ask you a little bit about that because I know there's a lot of first time authors that are very intimidated by the whole publishing process. So, would you call yourself a boutique publisher, a full service, self
I,
service?
yeah, well, I actually have two companies, but the main one, Chautauqua Press, is a small traditional royalty paying publishing company. As of just this year, I'm a member of Literary Press Group of Canada. I'm a member of the Association of Canadian Publishers. I have distribution through Lit Distco, which is one of the main literary distributors here in Canada. Through them, I have access to a sales force, so I've got people going out to bookstores and promoting my books to bookstores. So all that kind of stuff, very traditional model. Endless Sky Books is my other publishing company, and it's a publishing services company, so I help people self-publish their work. But some titles that I like at Endless Sky Books get published or distributed as an imprint of Chautauqua Press, so they get that same level of distribution, which is a big notch up from self-publishing as far as if you're looking for traditional distribution. So those are the two models I use. On the Endless Sky book side, because it's a publishing service company, people will pay me for the production costs up front in exchange for getting the bulk of the sales income after that. On the traditional side, of course, I pay a regular royalty, fairly typical royalty for a traditional publisher.
What is that?
Um, it's somewhere in the 8 to 10% of the cover price,
Okay.
depending on the format and things like that.
So, somebody told me that 10 cents a word.
10 cents a word is in the short story market is considered very good. I publish a anthology that I kickstart every year, featuring authors who are guests on my podcast, The Worldshapers, where I talk to other science fiction fantasy authors about the creative process. And I pay 10 cents a word Canadian for those stories, and that's considered not too bad. As a freelance writer, I prefer to get considerably more per word if I have to charge per word. But if you're actually figuring out what you're earning on the time you put into a book, even with a major publisher, if I look at the books I've had published by DAW Books in New York, and I think about how much time I put into them, and then you look at that 10% of the cover price, it doesn't work out to very many cents a word. It would vary from book to book and from publisher to publisher. And of course, it all boils down to ultimately what your sales are. But yeah, it doesn't do to think of it in terms of an hourly wage or cents per word if you're just thinking of it in financial terms.
What kind of advice would you give to somebody who was still interested in submitting their work to traditional publishers?
It's very straightforward. You have to, well, first of all, you have to write the thing, obviously. And in order to write it at a professional level, you better be a big reader. So read, write. That's always the first bit of advice. And then after that, it's just a matter of looking for a publisher that publishes the kind of book that you have written, that has those kinds of books in its line. You find out what their submission guidelines are. Some will require you to have an agent. If you have to get an agent, you have to go through the same process as you would to get a publisher, only you're doing it to find an agent, where you're sending out query letters and sending out usually sample chapters perhaps, or synopsis, depending on what they want. And then you wait a long time, and they might tell you that they'll publish it if you're lucky. There aren't any shortcuts on the traditional publishing side.
Well, is it almost as difficult to get an agent than it is just to get the publishing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's been a long time since I went through this process. I've had my agent now for a long time, and I got him by the most straightforward method of getting an agent is to get offered a publishing contract and then offer an agent to represent you, because they know immediately that they're going to get, 15% of whatever that publishing contract was, and that you've already sold a book, and hopefully they can help you sell more going forward. And that's how it worked for me. I got my agent after I had my first book contract. But just before that, I had tried to get an agent, and I queried, 20, 30, 40 agents. But again, we're looking in a different time. That was in the 90s probably when I was doing that. So I can't really say what it's like now, but I doubt it's gotten any easier.
Well, if you already had a contract, then you did all the work for the agent already. They would have been happy to.
Yeah, you have a contract, but you may not be, if you're a new author, you may not have seen a publishing contract before from a big publishing company, especially. And the agent has, and the agent knows what's negotiable, and will try to get you as good a deal as possible, and might hold back some rights or whatever that the publisher would really like to take. All publishing contracts are negotiable up to a point.
Well, that's good information. And so the book you've got, Soulworm. Now, you said this is a reprint. What does that mean? Does that mean it went out of print and now it's just back in print?
Yeah, Soulworm was published in 1997 by a very small publisher, and it has come back to me. And so I decided I wanted to bring it out again, give it a light revision. Obviously, I'm not the same writer I was. Although it came out in 97, I probably wrote it way back when I was in my 20s in the 1980s. It's actually set in Weyburn, my hometown, where I was the newspaper reporter and then editor. And although I did give it a light revision, it turned out it didn't need heavy rewriting. I was actually quite pleased by how it's still read after all these years. I hadn't read it in a long time. And I decided to leave it when it was written. So it's set in the 1980s in Weyburn, in a slightly fictionalized version of Weyburn, Saskatchewan. I even put on the new edition, I even put a Stranger Things font for the title on the front to kind of tap into that interest in the 80s that Stranger Things has brought about. But it's basically the same book that came out then. It's just with a new cover. And of course, it's back out in the marketplace and available for sale again when it hasn't been available for anybody to buy or read for a very long time. So it's just a hope that it might find a few new readers. And, I put all that work into it all that time ago, and it's just nice to know that it's still out there and can be discovered by people who might enjoy that kind of 1980s small town set fantasy/horror.
Okay, we've got just about 2 minutes. Can you give us a quick synopsis of the book?
It's kind of a tough one to give a quick synopsis, but very briefly, in a parallel world to ours, there is these things called soulworms. You can think of them as demons, or not really, but you can think of them as that. They possess people, and then they feed off of violence and hatred and all that kind of stuff. One of these things gets from that parallel world into our world and takes up residence in a teenage girl in Weyburn. In that other world, there's also these priestesses who fight these things, and one of them, a young woman, accidentally, her spirit gets sent into our world in pursuit of this Soulworm. She wasn't supposed to be sent because she hasn't fully gotten the powers of the priestesses that fight these things. Nevertheless, her spirit comes in. She ends up in the body of the best friend of this girl who's been possessed by the Soulworm in our world. And she doesn't have control of the body, at least for part of the book. Part of the book she does. So that's the setup. It's in our world. There's these two girls who are friends with each other. For part of the book, the one girl doesn't know that the other girl, she knows she's acting weird, but she doesn't know why. And then eventually our priestess character is able to take over the body of the girl in our world. And then she has to stop this Soulworm from creating an explosion of violence that it will feed on. And if it does that, it will multiply and take over our world. And our world has enough violence in it that it could be very happy here, but we wouldn't if the things took hold in our world. So that's the setup.
Okay, how is the Soulworm different than a sort of a traditional demonic possession?
It's just the backstory isn't like that. It's basically just a creature that is native to this other world. It's kind of a spiritual creature or a non-corporeal creature. But there's nothing particularly supernatural about it. I don't set it up that way. It's more like a parasite, I guess.
You working on anything new at this point?
I'm currently writing a nonfiction book that's based on my podcast. I'm focusing on the Canadian authors I've interviewed, and it will kind of give an overview of creative process of people who write science fiction fantasy and my process as well. So it'll be a book that I think will really interest other writers in those genres. And then after that, I've got a whole bunch of possible books to work on, and it's just a question of getting this out of the way, and then I'll be moving on into new novels. And I might be doing some more kickstarting to make those happen. Crowdfunding is something I'm now getting very comfortable with, so I may be looking at that to fund some of that work going forward. And I've got a book out, like a young adult fantasy, middle grade fantasy out right now that's being considered somewhere. So I don't know exactly what will come up next after this nonfiction book.
Let me ask you quickly about that. So you would do a Kickstarter campaign to get the funds to write a book?
I would. I've done 4 now for the anthologies. I've raised over $15,000 Canadian for each one of those anthologies.
Wow.
I haven't done it just for one of my own works, and I wouldn't look for that much money as a goal. I would probably set it for, I don't know, fairly low, maybe $2,000 or something, just to know that I have something coming in before I start writing this book, in the hope that you go higher than what you've set as your goal. And then, of course, you can sell the book after that. It's just to kind of cover that initial time commitment to write the book. I haven't done it. Other people have. And I'm very comfortable with Kickstarter campaigns now, having done these 4 for the anthologies. So it's something I'm thinking about for the new year. I've also done something called Crowdfunder, which is another crowdsourcing platform. So I'm getting very kind of comfortable in that realm.
So the people that give money, do they get the book for free once it's done?
That's kind of the basic reward. Usually at your lowest level, it'll be the ebook. And then for a bit more money, you can get a copy of the print book. And then there's other rewards you put in there. I've done all sorts of things. I offer mentorships even at the very highest level, and short story critiques. And there's something called Tuckerizations, where your name gets used as a character in the book. I've done those for some short stories in the anthology. So you can be very creative in the kind of rewards, but the basic rewards are always you helped make this book get written and published, and now here's your copy of it as your reward.
Okay, well, that's great. I've never heard of that, but that sounds like a good deal all the way around.
It's an awful lot of work to run one of those campaigns, but it's worrisome, because if you don't fund, you don't get any money, at least on the Kickstarter model. So if you don't reach your goal, all that work goes for nothing. So it's a bit stressful, but so far I've done 4 of them, and I'll be doing a 5th one for another anthology in the new year as well.
Well, Ed, we got to wrap this up. Thanks so much for coming on. Nice talking to you again. Give out your website, please.
My website is edwardwillett.com, EDWARDWILLETT.com. My publishing company is shadowpawpress.com.
Okay, great. Well, again, thanks for coming on. Best of luck with the reissue of your book and everything else you're doing.
Thank you so much.